My name is Nia, and I am 34 years old. My parents sent my son home with a wrapped box and a warning to tell your mother not to overreact. My 10-year-old son Trey was shaking when he handed it to me. I opened it and immediately called the authorities. My best friend Mia arrived just as a federal agent stepped inside. Then my husband came home, saw the person beside me, and went pale, asking, "What is he doing here?" Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the shadow of a prominent Atlanta megachurch meant my life was a carefully orchestrated performance. My parents, Pastor Jerome and First Lady Beatrice, demanded absolute perfection to maintain their public image. I was never the child they wanted to showcase. That honor belonged to my younger sister Dominique. She was the golden child, the vibrant socialite who ran a luxury lifestyle brand. She was the darling of the congregation, standing beside our parents on Sunday mornings, dripping in designer clothes. I, on the other hand, was the quiet disappointment. They thought I was just a boring girl who typed on a computer. They belittled my career, assuming I did basic tech support for pennies. My husband Andre was no better. He was an image-obsessed wealth manager who craved the high society spotlight my family provided. He resented my understated nature and constantly complained that I did not dress the part of a successful broker wife. They all severely underestimated me. They had no idea that the small tech business they mocked was actually Apex Omni Logistics. I am the founder and chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar firm that manages back-end logistics and cybersecurity for global brands. My daily life involves handling complex data architecture and neutralizing corporate threats. I kept my family in the dark about my wealth because their greed knew no bounds. I never expected them to sink low enough to steal from my innocent child. It was a Sunday afternoon when everything shattered. The heavy front door clicked open and my son Trey walked inside. He had just been dropped off by my father in his luxury sport utility vehicle. Trey did not take off his jacket or drop his backpack. He stood in the foyer, trembling, clutching a small box wrapped in dark red velvet paper. I saw the sheer terror in his eyes. I rushed over and knelt, asking what was wrong. Trey handed me the box with shaking hands. He swallowed hard and whispered that his grandmother told him to give this to me. Then his voice cracked as he delivered a message that made my blood run freezing cold. He said they told him that if I called the bank, my husband Andre would go to federal prison and it would be all my fault. I pulled my son into a tight hug, shielding my face so he could not see my rage. I told him in my calmest voice that everything was going to be fine. I kissed his forehead and sent him upstairs to play his video game. I waited until his door clicked shut. Then I turned my attention to the velvet box. I ripped the red paper apart, tearing the lid off. Inside sat a cheap plastic calculator from a local dollar store. It was a mocking gesture, a cruel joke about me being a math nerd. Underneath that calculator lay a thick stack of official legal documents. I recognized the letterhead immediately. It was from the institution that held the trust fund my late paternal grandmother established exclusively for Trey. The account was meant to sit untouched until his 18th birthday, guaranteeing his future. I scanned the top document, and my heart slammed against my ribs. The entire balance of $250,000 was completely gone. Every single penny had been drained. I flipped frantically to the transfer logs. The money had been wired directly into the commercial business accounts of Dominique failing lifestyle brand. My parents had stolen their grandson future to bail out their golden child bankrupt company. Clipped to the bank statement was a yellow sticky note written in my mother Beatrice's cursive handwriting. The note read, "Do not overreact, Nia, because family helps family, and Dominique needed this bridge capital to save the church reputation." I flipped to the final page. It was a transfer authorization form giving the bank explicit permission to liquidate the trust. At the bottom sat my signature. But I had never signed that paper. I stared closely at the ink strokes. It was a blatant forgery. My own husband, an expert in financial documents, had forged my signature to give my parents access to the money. He sold out his own son to please his toxic in-laws and impress my sister. Most women would have collapsed. Most women would have screamed, cried, or called their mother demanding an explanation. I did none of those things. I am a cybersecurity analyst who hunts down financial criminals for a living. You do not steal from a woman who builds banking security systems and expect to get away with it. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and bypassed the local police department entirely. This was a massive coordinated financial crime crossing state banking lines. I dialed a direct number I had saved in my encrypted contacts. It was the federal tip line for the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had worked directly with these agents during security audits. I knew exactly who to call to initiate an immediate response. I gave the dispatcher my credentials and requested Agent Carter, a seasoned investigator I had collaborated with on a major corporate embezzlement case last year. I explained that a licensed wealth manager committed wire fraud to drain $250,000 from a protected trust fund. As soon as I hung up, I called my best friend Mia. Mia is a ruthless corporate attorney who takes absolutely no prisoners. She has known my family since college and always despised how they treated me. I told her I needed her at my house right this second because I was about to drop a nuclear bomb on my entire family. Mia arrived in less than 20 minutes, her car screeching into my driveway. She marched through my front door wearing a tailored suit and a lethal expression. I handed her the forged documents without saying a word. She scanned the pages, her eyes narrowing, as she processed the sheer audacity of the crime. She looked up at me and promised we were going to bury them so deep they would never see sunlight again. Just as Mia finished speaking, an unmarked black sedan pulled smoothly up to the curb outside my house. Agent Carter stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket. He walked up the path and flashed his federal badge through the glass of my front door. I let him in and led him straight to the dining room table where the evidence lay. Agent Carter reviewed the paperwork. He confirmed that the fraudulent transfer, combined with Andre's status as a licensed financial broker, elevated this to a severe federal offense. We were standing around the table quietly discussing the immediate legal steps to freeze the receiving accounts when the heavy front door suddenly unlocked. The hinges groaned as the door swung wide open. My husband Andre strolled into the foyer. He looked incredibly pleased with himself, whistling a cheerful church hymn. He was dressed impeccably in his tailored Sunday suit, straight from the megachurch service he attended with my parents. In his left hand, he was casually swinging a small, glossy gift bag from an exclusive luxury jeweler. He was completely oblivious to the trap he had just walked into. Andre looked up, a charming, rehearsed smile forming on his lips, ready to offer whatever smooth lie he prepared to explain his afternoon absence. He expected to find his quiet, submissive wife waiting to serve him lunch. Instead, his eyes landed on the dining room table. He saw me standing tall and unyielding. He saw Mia glaring at him with absolute disgust. And then his gaze shifted to Agent Carter, who turned around, fully displaying the golden federal badge clipped to his belt. The arrogant smile vanished from Andre's face instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw dropped open as his brain struggled to process the scene in front of him. The shiny jewelry bag slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp, heavy thud. He staggered backward, his shoulders hitting the doorframe as he realized his entire world was about to collapse. He pointed a trembling finger at the man in the dark suit and stammered, asking, "What is he doing here?" Andre stared at Agent Carter, then back at me. The smug veneer he wore like a second skin completely evaporated. His eyes darted to the table where the velvet box and the forged bank transfer lay under the harsh dining room chandelier. Panic, raw and unpolished, hijacked his features. He lunged forward. His expensive leather shoes slipped slightly on the polished oak floor as he reached across the table, desperate to snatch the documents away from the federal agent. I stepped back, but Agent Carter did not flinch. With a swift, practiced motion, Carter slammed his hand down flat over the papers, pinning them to the wood. He stared Andre dead in the eye, his voice low and dangerous, warning him to step back immediately. Andre threw his hands up in mock surrender, but his chest heaved. He immediately pivoted to his favorite defense mechanism. He pointed at me, his voice pitching an octave higher as he addressed the federal agent. He claimed I was having a mental episode. He shouted that I had been unstable for months, that I was imagining conspiracies, and that this was a private family misunderstanding blown completely out of proportion by a hysterical woman. Mia let out a sharp, humorless laugh. She crossed her arms, her tailored blazer pulling tight. She asked Andre if a mental episode was responsible for the exact replication of my signature on a $250,000 wire transfer. She asked him if my hysteria had somehow walked into the bank branch on Peachtree Street yesterday at 2 in the afternoon and handed the teller a fraudulent authorization form. Andre ignored Mia. He turned his desperate, furious gaze entirely on me. He demanded I tell the agent to leave. He ordered me to stop embarrassing our family. He insisted that I was making a massive mistake and that I did not understand how the real world worked. I looked at the man I had married 10 years ago, the man who had promised to protect our son. I asked him calmly if the real world involved stealing our 10-year-old child future to fund my sister vanity projects. Andre scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the high ceilings of our home. He stepped closer, his face twisting with a mixture of arrogance and panic. He told me I was just a back-end web developer who spent all day typing code in the dark. He yelled that I did not understand high finance or the complexities of wealth management. He said Dominique needed bridge capital to save her luxury lifestyle brand. He practically spat the words at me, claiming that if Dominique business failed, it would humiliate my parents. It would destroy the church flawless image. He justified his theft by saying family helps family, echoing the exact toxic phrase my mother had written on that yellow sticky note. He genuinely believed I was too stupid to grasp the severity of what he had done. He thought because I wore comfortable sweaters and worked from a home office, I was blind to the mechanics of money. He told me I was selfish for hoarding a trust fund, when the First Family of Atlanta needed liquid cash to maintain their community standing. He said Trey would understand when he was older. He said I was blowing a simple internal family loan out of proportion. He told me that my father, Pastor Jerome, had personally blessed the transaction. He thought dropping my father title would force me into submission, just like it always did when we were children. I let him finish his frantic, pathetic rant. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply walked over to the kitchen island and picked up my tablet. I tapped the screen, entering my encrypted passcode. The glow of the device illuminated my face as I turned back to face my husband. I told him he was right about one thing. I told him I do type code in the dark, but I asked him if he knew exactly whose code I was typing. Andre blinked, confused by the shift in my tone. I walked toward him, holding the tablet out so he could see the screen. I told him my company does not just build simple websites. I explained that Apex Omni Logistics manages back-end cybersecurity for the exact offshore banking institutions he used to hide his illicit commissions. I tapped a secure folder on my screen. A cascading list of banking logs, routing numbers, and shell company names populated the display. I read the name of his secret corporation aloud. I recited the account numbers he held in the Cayman Islands. I listed the exact dollar amounts he had skimmed from his wealthy clients over the past 4 years, funneled through dummy corporations set up under Dominique brand. Andre stopped breathing. His eyes widened to the size of saucers as he stared at the screen. He reached out with a trembling hand, but I pulled the tablet back. I told him I knew he forged my signature to steal Trey money, but I also knew that the $250,000 was just a drop in the bucket. It was a desperate move to cover a massive shortfall because his offshore accounts had been suddenly frozen. He gasped, demanding to know how I knew about the freeze. I smiled, tapping another sequence on my screen. I told him I knew about the freeze because I was the one who initiated it. I showed him the real-time server feed. I explained that when I found out my parents and my sister were pressuring him for cash, I ran a deep diagnostic on his personal devices. I bypassed his pathetic firewalls in less than 3 minutes. I uncovered every fake invoice, every illegal transfer, and every hidden asset he thought he had cleverly buried. Then I told him the best part. I told him that as a verified security vendor for his offshore bank, I had flagged his accounts for international money laundering 12 hours ago. I pointed to a red flashing status bar on my tablet screen. I narrated the action as it happened. I told him to watch closely as his final secret account, the one holding his escape funds, was permanently locked by federal authorities. The status changed from active to frozen right before his eyes. Andre let out a strangled animalistic sound. He stumbled backward, his hands gripping his hair. He looked at Mia, who was smiling like a shark smelling blood in the water. He looked at Agent Carter, who was already unholstering his heavy metal handcuffs. Agent Carter stepped forward, his heavy boots sounding like a death knell on the hardwood floor. He grabbed Andre by the shoulder and spun him around, forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the quiet dining room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Andre began to hyperventilate. He begged Agent Carter to stop swearing he could explain the trust fund, promising he would pay the money back tomorrow. He cried out that he was a respected member of the community, that he sat on the board of the largest megachurch in the city. He pleaded that this would ruin his reputation and shame his prestigious clients. Agent Carter tightened the steel cuffs and leaned in close. He informed my husband that the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not arrest people over domestic trust fund disputes. Carter stated clearly that Andre was being taken into federal custody for 12 counts of wire fraud, international money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud investors. As Agent Carter began reading Andre his Miranda rights, my husband began to thrash. He twisted in the agent iron grip, crying out my name, begging me to call my father, begging me to tell the church elders to send their elite legal team. The sheer panic in his sudden, erratic movements caused his tailored suit jacket to whip violently from side to side. His smartphone, which had been loosely tucked into his inner breast pocket, dislodged. It flew through the air and hit the floor face down. The hard impact caused the screen to wake up. It flipped over, sliding across the polished wood until it stopped right at the tip of my designer shoe. I looked down. The phone screen was glowing brightly in the dimming afternoon light. A text message banner sat squarely in the center of his lock screen, vibrating with an incoming notification. I did not have to hack his device to read this one. The sender name was saved simply as Dominique. The preview text was impossible to miss. It read, "Did you get the money from the boring wife? Miss you in my bed." Andre stared at the glowing screen on the hardwood floor. He lunged for the device, but Agent Carter planted his heavy boot directly over the phone. Carter scooped up the phone, bagging it as federal evidence before Andre could even take another breath. The color fully drained from Andre's face as he was marched out my front door in handcuffs. I stood in my foyer, breathing in the quiet peace of my home. But I knew the silence would not last because my family never surrendered without a holy war. Less than 24 hours later, the phone calls began. High-priced defense attorneys work incredibly fast when megachurch money is involved. Andre was out on bail by Sunday morning. I expected a call from him begging for mercy, or at least asking to speak to our son. Instead, my phone buzzed with a direct summons from First Lady Vivian. My mother did not ask if I was all right. She did not ask how Trey was handling the trauma of his father getting arrested. She simply demanded I attend the traditional Sunday dinner at their sprawling pastoral estate. She framed it as a necessary family healing session, but I knew better. It was a coordinated ambush designed to break my resolve. Mia advised me to stay home and let the federal prosecutors handle the mess. But I needed to look my family in the eye. I needed to see exactly how far my parents were willing to go to protect a thief and an adulterer over their own flesh and blood. I dressed carefully, choosing a tailored emerald green dress that commanded respect. For 34 years, I had shrunk myself to make them feel larger. I wore dull colors and kept my head down, playing the role of the boring tech nerd they assigned to me. Today, I walked into the lion's den holding my head high and carrying a secret arsenal of information. The pastoral mansion was a monument to congregational donations. Towering marble columns framed the entrance and a fleet of luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway. I walked through the double doors and followed the sound of hushed voices into the formal dining room. The entire family was already seated around the massive mahogany table. The air in the room was thick with tension and the heavy scent of roasted meats. Pastor Jerome sat at the head of the table, radiating righteous fury. He wore his tailored Sunday suit, his heavy gold watch catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. My mother, Vivian, sat to his right, draped in expensive silk and wearing a permanent scowl. Sitting directly across from her was Dominique, perfectly styled, and dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a linen napkin. Andre sat right next to Dominique, rubbing his wrists where the federal handcuffs had bruised his skin. He had the absolute nerve to glare at me as if I was the criminal who had destroyed the peace of the afternoon. No one offered a prayer over the food. The clinking of silver forks against fine china echoed like swords crossing in battle. My mother grabbed the heavy crystal bowl of sweet potatoes and shoved it across the table toward me. She did not offer an apology for my husband's infidelity. She did not express outrage that my sister had conspired to steal $250,000 from her own 10-year-old nephew. Instead, she looked me up and down with absolute disdain. She told me that if I just paid more attention to Andre instead of playing my little computer games, his eyes would not wander to a real woman like my sister. The sheer cruelty of her words hung in the oppressive air. She was openly endorsing my husband's affair with my sister right in front of me. She blamed my career for his wandering eye, completely ignoring that my little computer games had built an empire that could buy and sell her entire pastoral estate 10 times over. Dominique sniffled loudly, playing the tragic victim for her captive audience. She claimed she never meant to hurt me, but that Andre was drowning in our passionless marriage. She said he was a visionary man who needed a partner capable of matching his ambitions. She framed her betrayal as an act of mercy, stating she simply provided a listening ear to a desperate man. I placed my fork down, resting my hands flat on the mahogany table. I looked directly at Dominique and asked her if a listening ear cost $250,000. Andre slammed his fist on the table, demanding I show some respect to the family. He was emboldened by the presence of my parents fully retreating under their protective wing. He arrogantly stated that the money was a temporary bridge loan authorized by the head of the family. He scoffed, telling me I was just a back-end web developer who did not understand high finance. He claimed Dominique needed bridge capital to save the church public image and that I was too small-minded to grasp the bigger picture. This instantly revealed his complete disregard for my intellect and his total complicity with my family toxic hierarchy. He truly believed that stealing from my son was a noble sacrifice for the greater good of the megachurch brand. He thought he could speak down to me because my parents were nodding along in agreement. That was my father cue to take control. Pastor Jerome leaned forward, folding his heavy hands together on the table. He looked at me with the same terrifying glare he used to subjugate his 10,000-member congregation every Sunday morning. He told me I was acting out of bitter jealousy, because Dominique possessed a light that I would never understand. He declared that Dominique luxury lifestyle brand was a beacon of hope for the community, and that the church's pristine reputation rested heavily on her continued commercial success. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp legal document. He slid the paper down the length of the mahogany table until it stopped directly at the edge of my plate. It was a retroactive consent form drafted by the elite legal team on the church payroll. He demanded I sign it immediately, legally declaring that I had authorized the trust fund transfer all along. He said it would instantly clear Andre of the federal wire fraud charges and protect the family name from a catastrophic public scandal. I stared at the paper. Then I looked up at my father. I kept my voice completely deadpan and asked him what would happen if I refused to sign away my son's stolen future. Pastor Jerome's face turned a deep shade of purple with uncontrollable rage. He slammed his palm on the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. He threatened to excommunicate me from the church entirely. He promised to stand at the pulpit next Sunday and publicly humiliate me in front of 10,000 devoted followers. He said he would brand me an unfit mother, a violently jealous sister, and a bitter, vindictive wife who tried to destroy a man of God out of pure spite. He swore he would leverage his immense political and social power to ensure I would not be able to show my face in the city of Atlanta ever again. My mother nodded along with his threats, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. They genuinely thought the threat of public shame would break me. They thought I still cared about the opinions of a congregation that funded their lavish, unholy lifestyle. They believed my silence over the years was a sign of weakness rather than a sign of calculation. I looked at the retroactive consent form sitting beside my plate. Then I looked at the arrogant, self-satisfied faces of my husband, my sister, and my parents. They were a pack of wolves who thought they had finally cornered a helpless sheep. I slowly stood up from my chair, smoothing the fine fabric of my emerald dress. I picked up my linen napkin and calmly wiped my mouth. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I slid it right across the gravy boat, sending it directly into my father's hands. I told them I was not dropping the charges. I told them that in fact I was just getting started. I instructed my father to open the folder. He ripped it open, his eyes rapidly scanning the pages. Andre and Dominique leaned in their arrogant expressions, instantly melting into utter confusion. Inside were high-resolution photographs taken just hours ago by my corporate logistics team. They were aerial and interior photos of Dominique's massive luxury warehouse, the exact facility supposedly housing millions of dollars in premium haircare inventory. The photos showed a completely empty concrete shell. Not a single cardboard box was on the shelves. Not a single bottle of product was on the pallets. There was just dust, concrete floors, and empty space. I smiled at my sister's terrified face and asked her exactly what bridge capital she needed for a business that does not actually exist. Dominique's face crumbled as the photos scattered across the mahogany table. The fake tears she had been dabbing at vanished, instantly replaced by the raw, panicked realization of a cornered animal. My father, Pastor Jerome, snatched up the glossy images, his heavy jowls shaking as he stared at the concrete void where his golden child's supposed empire should have been. My mother Vivian gasped, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly I thought the string might snap. Andre looked like he was going to be physically sick right onto his untouched plate of sweet potatoes. I did not wait for their excuses or their inevitable attempts to spin this new, undeniable truth. I turned on my heel and walked out of the sprawling pastoral estate, leaving them drowning in their own exposed lies. As I slid behind the steering wheel of my car, my phone vibrated in my purse. It was Mia. She had been tracking the federal case filings and monitoring the fallout from Andre's arrest, but her voice was tight with sudden urgency. She told me Dominique had rushed out the back door of the estate mere seconds after I left the dining room. Mia warned me that narcissists do not retreat when they are exposed, they escalate. She told me Dominique would strike at my most vulnerable point to regain leverage. My heart slammed against my ribs. Trey. I threw the car into drive and sped toward Atlanta Preparatory Academy. My tires shrieked as I navigated the winding suburban roads, pushing my vehicle as fast as I dared. I knew exactly what my sister was capable of doing when she felt threatened. Dominique had spent her entire life manipulating reality to suit her narrative and bending people to her will. If her business was exposed as a hollow shell, she would need a new spectacular crisis to distract my parents and the church elders from her financial crimes. Painting me as an unfit, hysterical mother was her perfect smokescreen. I pulled into the pristine, brick-paved driveway of the elite private school. My stomach dropped into my shoes. Dominique's bright yellow Porsche was parked haphazardly right in the red-painted fire lane blocking the main crosswalk. She had not even bothered to turn off the engine. I marched through the heavy glass double doors of the main administrative building. The school lobby was an expansive space with vaulted ceilings and polished marble floors. It was normally a quiet environment of refined academic excellence where hushed tones were mandatory. Today, it was the grand stage for Dominique's greatest theatrical performance. My sister was leaning over the massive mahogany reception desk. She had reapplied her makeup perfectly in the car, but managed to conjure a stream of genuine-looking tears that rolled delicately down her cheeks. She was gripping the hands of Mrs. Sterling, the school principal, who looked deeply distressed and entirely captivated by the performance. Dominique was speaking in a breathless, panicked whisper that was intentionally loud enough for the entire administrative staff to hear. She claimed that our family was in the middle of a massive crisis. She spun a frantic, compelling lie that I had suffered a total psychotic break that morning. She told the principal that my husband Andre had been falsely arrested because of my paranoid delusions and that I was currently a danger to myself and my young son. She begged Mrs. Sterling to release Trey into her custody immediately, claiming she was the only stable family member left to protect him from my supposed madness. Mrs. Sterling was nodding, her brow furrowed in deep sympathy. She reached for the phone on her desk, preparing to call Trey Classroom and have him brought down to the lobby. I stepped forward, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I called out Mrs. Sterling, name, my voice ringing with absolute calm authority. Everyone in the lobby froze. Dominique whipped around her perfect hair, swinging over her shoulder. For a fraction of a second, genuine terror flashed in her eyes before she smoothly shifted back into her role as the deeply concerned glamorous aunt. Mrs. Sterling looked between us, her hand still resting on the receiver. She stammered, saying that Dominique had just informed them of a terrible family medical emergency and that they were moving to secure the children. I walked directly up to the desk, standing shoulder to shoulder with my sister. I did not look at Dominique. I maintained steady, unwavering eye contact with the principal. I informed Mrs. Sterling that there was no medical emergency whatsoever. I stated clearly that my sister was attempting to unlawfully remove my son from school grounds to use him as leverage in an ongoing federal fraud investigation involving her and my husband. Dominique let out a dramatic, wounded gasp. She turned to the gathering crowd of school counselors and administrative assistants. She threw her hands over her mouth, shaking her head in mock horror. She cried out, asking them to look at my cold, detached behavior. She claimed my wild accusations about federal investigations were absolute proof of my deteriorating mental state. She pleaded with the staff, saying she just wanted to get her sweet nephew to safety before my paranoia escalated into physical violence. She was masterful. She played the beautiful, wealthy savior perfectly. The staff members were exchanging uncertain glances, clearly swaying toward the weeping woman draped in designer silk. Then Dominique leaned in close to me. She dropped her volume so only I could hear the venom dripping from her words. The sweet, concerned aunt vanished entirely, replaced by the vicious bully I had known since childhood. She hissed that I was making a fool of myself. She sneered, reminding me that I had always been the ugly duckling of the family. She whispered that no one in this prestigious school or anywhere else in Atlanta was ever going to believe the quiet, dark-skinned nerd over the first family. She promised that by the end of the day, my parents would have the church elite legal team draft an emergency guardianship order. She vowed to take Trey from me legally permanently and humiliate me in front of the entire 10,000-member congregation. She smiled, a cruel, jagged thing, and stated that I was nothing without my family name to protect me. Most women would have slapped her across her perfectly contoured face. Most mothers would have screamed and caused the exact kind of dramatic scene Dominique was hoping for to prove her fabricated story of my mental instability. I did none of those things. I am a woman who writes complex security protocols for global banking networks. I anticipate threats and I build impenetrable firewalls before the breach ever happens. I slowly turned my head and looked Dominique up and down. I let the silence stretch between us until her cruel smile began to falter and twitch. Then I turned my attention back to the principal. I reached into my structured leather tote bag. I bypassed my tablet and pulled out a thick manila folder containing the injunctions Mia had spent the morning securing. I opened the clasp and slid a crisp legal document across the reception desk, precisely stopping it over Dominique's perfectly manicured hands. I told Mrs. Sterling that this was a court-stamped restraining order. I explained that it had been fast-tracked by my attorney and signed by a federal judge just 1 hour ago. The document explicitly barred Andre and Dominique from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, my business, or my son. To ensure the school understood the absolute legal weight of my claim, I tapped the cover sheet. I informed Mrs. Sterling that this protective mandate was supported by extensive digital evidence logs filed directly with the court. I noted aloud that the primary affidavits and emergency custody affirmations were fully detailed in a file named duyen1_9.docx. I pointed to the secondary supporting evidence packet, stating it was officially registered as duyen2_9.docx. I continued listing the annexes for the principal, making sure my sister heard every word. I explained that the financial threat assessments proving Dominique criminal liability were securely logged in duyen3_9. DOCX, and the final indisputable custody protections were finalized in duyen4_9.docx. Dominique stared down at the paperwork. The heavy black ink of the judge's signature was undeniable. The official embossed seal of the court gleamed in the overhead light. Her jaw dropped and the manufactured tears instantly dried up, leaving her face pale and slack. I kept my voice loud enough for the entire administrative staff to hear. I informed Mrs. Sterling that my sister was currently in direct violation of a federal protective order. I requested that the school security team remove her from the premises immediately before I was forced to call the local police department and have her arrested right there in the lobby for violating the mandate. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The sympathetic glances previously directed at Dominique morphed into expressions of shock and severe disapproval. The illusion was entirely broken. Mrs. Sterling did not hesitate for another second. She picked up her radio and called for the campus security officers with a sharp, urgent tone. Two large men in uniform appeared from the hallway within seconds. Mrs. Sterling pointed directly at Dominique and instructed the men to escort her off the school property immediately and ensure she did not return under any circumstances. Dominique's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The polished First Lady persona completely shattered into a million pieces. She realized she had lost her ultimate leverage. She realized she could not use my child as a pawn in her desperate game of survival. As the security officers flanked her, grasping her arms firmly to guide her toward the glass exit doors, she lost all control. She dug her expensive heels into the marble floor, fighting wildly against their grip. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing harshly through the refined academic halls. She abandoned the concerned aunt act entirely. She shrieked that I would pay dearly for this public humiliation. She thrashed against the guards, her designer bag falling to the floor, as she promised that she would destroy everything I had ever built. As the guards shoved her forcefully through the double doors, her final threat cut through the afternoon air. She screamed that she would completely ruin my business by tomorrow morning and that I would be left begging in the streets. Andre stared at the glowing screen on the hardwood floor. He lunged for the device, but Agent Carter planted his heavy boot directly over the phone. Carter scooped up the phone, bagging it as federal evidence before Andre could even take another breath. The color fully drained from Andre's face as he was marched out my front door in handcuffs. I stood in my foyer, breathing in the quiet peace of my home, but I knew the silence would not last, because my family never surrendered without a holy war. Less than 24 hours later, the phone calls began. High-priced defense attorneys work incredibly fast when megachurch money is involved. Andre was out on bail by Sunday morning. I expected a call from him begging for mercy, or at least asking to speak to our son. Instead, my phone buzzed with a direct summons from First Lady Vivian. My mother did not ask if I was all right. She did not ask how Trey was handling the trauma of his father getting arrested. She simply demanded I attend the traditional Sunday dinner at their sprawling pastoral estate. She framed it as a necessary family healing session, but I knew better. It was a coordinated ambush designed to break my resolve. Mia advised me to stay home and let the federal prosecutors handle the mess. But I needed to look my family in the eye. I needed to see exactly how far my parents were willing to go to protect a thief and an adulterer over their own flesh and blood. I dressed carefully, choosing a tailored emerald green dress that commanded respect. For 34 years, I had shrunk myself to make them feel larger. I wore dull colors and kept my head down, playing the role of the boring tech nerd they assigned to me. Today, I walked into the lion's den holding my head high and carrying a secret arsenal of information. The pastoral mansion was a monument to congregational donations. Towering marble columns framed the entrance, and a fleet of luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway. I walked through the double doors and followed the sound of hushed voices into the formal dining room. The entire family was already seated around the massive mahogany table. The air in the room was thick with tension and the heavy scent of roasted meats. Pastor Jerome sat at the head of the table, radiating righteous fury. He wore his tailored Sunday suit, his heavy gold watch catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. My mother Vivian sat to his right, draped in expensive silk and wearing a permanent scowl. Sitting directly across from her was Dominique, perfectly styled and dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a linen napkin. Andre sat right next to Dominique, rubbing his wrist where the federal handcuffs had bruised his skin. He had the absolute nerve to glare at me as if I was the criminal who had destroyed the peace of the afternoon. No one offered a prayer over the food. The clinking of silver forks against fine china echoed like swords crossing in battle. My mother grabbed the heavy crystal bowl of sweet potatoes and shoved it across the table toward me. She did not offer an apology for my husband's infidelity. She did not express outrage that my sister had conspired to steal $250,000 from her own 10-year-old nephew. Instead, she looked me up and down with absolute disdain. She told me that if I just paid more attention to Andre instead of playing my little computer games, his eyes would not wander to a real woman like my sister. The sheer cruelty of her words hung in the oppressive air. She was openly endorsing my husband's affair with my sister right in front of me. She blamed my career for his wandering eye, completely ignoring that my little computer games had built an empire that could buy and sell her entire pastoral estate 10 times over. Dominique sniffled loudly, playing the tragic victim for her captive audience. She claimed she never meant to hurt me, but that Andre was drowning in our passionless marriage. She said he was a visionary man who needed a partner capable of matching his ambitions. She framed her betrayal as an act of mercy, stating she simply provided a listening ear to a desperate man. I placed my fork down, resting my hands flat on the mahogany table. I looked directly at Dominique and asked her if a listening ear cost $250,000. Andre slammed his fist on the table, demanding I show some respect to the family. He was emboldened by the presence of my parents fully retreating under their protective wing. He arrogantly stated that the money was a temporary bridge loan authorized by the head of the family. He scoffed, telling me I was just a back-end web developer who did not understand high finance. He claimed Dominique needed bridge capital to save the church public image, and that I was too small-minded to grasp the bigger picture. This instantly revealed his complete disregard for my intellect and his total complicity with my family toxic hierarchy. He truly believed that stealing from my son was a noble sacrifice for the greater good of the megachurch brand. He thought he could speak down to me because my parents were nodding along in agreement. That was my father's cue to take control. Pastor Jerome leaned forward, folding his heavy hands together on the table. He looked at me with the same terrifying glare he used to subjugate his 10,000-member congregation every Sunday morning. He told me I was acting out of bitter jealousy because Dominique possessed a light that I would never understand. He declared that Dominique Luxury Lifestyle brand was a beacon of hope for the community, and that the church's pristine reputation rested heavily on her continued commercial success. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp legal document. He slid the paper down the length of the mahogany table until it stopped directly at the edge of my plate. It was a retroactive consent form drafted by the elite legal team on the church payroll. He demanded I sign it immediately, legally declaring that I had authorized the trust fund transfer all along. He said it would instantly clear Andre of the federal wire fraud charges and protect the family name from a catastrophic public scandal. I stared at the paper. Then I looked up at my father. I kept my voice completely deadpan and asked him what would happen if I refused to sign away my son's stolen future. Pastor Jerome's face turned a deep shade of purple with uncontrollable rage. He slammed his palm on the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. He threatened to excommunicate me from the church entirely. He promised to stand at the pulpit next Sunday and publicly humiliate me in front of 10,000 devoted followers. He said he would brand me an unfit mother, a violently jealous sister, and a bitter, vindictive wife who tried to destroy a man of God out of pure spite. He swore he would leverage his immense political and social power to ensure I would not be able to show my face in the city of Atlanta ever again. My mother nodded along with his threats, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. They genuinely thought the threat of public shame would break me. They thought I still cared about the opinions of a congregation that funded their lavish, unholy lifestyle. They believed my silence over the years was a sign of weakness, rather than a sign of calculation. I looked at the retroactive consent form sitting beside my plate. Then I looked at the arrogant, self-satisfied faces of my husband, my sister, and my parents. They were a pack of wolves who thought they had finally cornered a helpless sheep. I slowly stood up from my chair, smoothing the fine fabric of my emerald dress. I picked up my linen napkin and calmly wiped my mouth. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I slid it right across the gravy boat, sending it directly into my father's hands. I told them I was not dropping the charges. I told them that in fact I was just getting started. I instructed my father to open the folder. He ripped it open, his eyes rapidly scanning the pages. Andre and Dominique leaned in their arrogant expressions, instantly melting into utter confusion. Inside were high-resolution photographs taken just hours ago by my corporate logistics team. They were aerial and interior photos of Dominique's massive luxury warehouse, the exact facility supposedly housing millions of dollars in premium hair care inventory. The photos showed a completely empty concrete shell. Not a single cardboard box was on the shelves. Not a single bottle of product was on the pallets. There was just dust, concrete floors, and empty space. I smiled at my sister's terrified face and asked her exactly what bridge capital she needed for a business that does not actually exist. I watched Dominique's yellow Porsche peel out of the circular driveway, her tires screeching in a desperate display of defeated rage. Mrs. Sterling stood beside me in the school lobby, visibly shaken by the sheer venom my sister had just unleashed. I assured the principal that Trey was entirely safe and that my legal team had already established a direct line of communication with the local precinct to enforce the restraining order. I requested that Trey finish his school day normally without disruption. My son needed routine, and I needed absolute silence to execute the next phase of my strategy. I walked out to my car, breathing in the crisp afternoon air. The familial war had officially shifted from the dining room table to my domain. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Dominique and Andre launched their coordinated retaliation. They truly believed they held the superior tactical position. They assumed my quiet demeanor equated to absolute powerlessness. My smartphone chimed with a rapid succession of automated banking alerts. Andre, having somehow managed to retain access to his laptop while out on bail, was systematically attempting to financially suffocate me. He initiated emergency freezes on our joint checking and savings accounts. He canceled the primary credit cards associated with my name, leaving me supposedly without a single active line of credit. He did not stop at personal accounts. Andre dialed the property management group listed on a piece of mail he had dug out of my home office trash can last week. It was the billing address for what he mockingly called my small office space. He proudly identified himself as my husband and attempted to terminate the commercial lease effective immediately. He told the leasing agent that my freelance web design business was insolvent and that I was suffering a mental breakdown. Simultaneously, Dominique took to her massive social media platforms. She posted cryptic, aggressive messages to her millions of followers, implying that a jealous, unstable family member was trying to extort her successful lifestyle brand. They expected me to wake up completely destitute, locked out of my own life, and begging them for mercy. They expected me to call my father crying for financial salvation. They were playing a child game of checkers while I was operating a global chessboard. I sat in my home office sipping black coffee. My workspace was not a small desk with a basic laptop. It was a climate-controlled server hub featuring 4 ultra-high-definition curved monitors hardwired directly into a dedicated fiber optic line. I watched Andre's pathetic attempts at financial sabotage scroll across my secondary screen in real time. He had no idea he was attacking a digital ghost. The joint accounts he so gleefully froze had been entirely empty of my personal capital for over 6 months. I had transferred all of my substantial executive compensation into a blind trust managed by an elite wealth management firm in Geneva. The credit cards he canceled were decoy accounts with strict $500 limits specifically left active for him to monitor and feel in control. And the commercial lease he attempted to terminate was nothing more than a glorified mail drop in a strip mall. Apex Omni Logistics was headquartered in a highly secure commercial fortress downtown, purchased outright through an anonymous holding company. He had accomplished absolutely nothing. I set my coffee mug down. It was time to show my sister exactly what a back-end web developer could do. I turned my attention to my primary monitor. Dominique Lifestyle brand was built entirely on a carefully curated illusion of seamless luxury. Her customers paid exorbitant prices for basic serums and imported clothing because the purchasing experience felt exclusive. She shipped thousands of units globally every single day. She boasted about her massive profit margins at every family gathering. But Dominique had never bothered to understand how her own digital infrastructure actually functioned. She simply paid invoices to a corporate entity named Apex Omni Logistics, believing it was a faceless corporate vendor handling her server hosting, inventory routing, and secure payment gateways. She never read the fine print of her service-level agreements. She never checked the names of the executive board. She never realized her despised older sister held the keys to her entire kingdom. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I accessed the master control panel for her e-commerce architecture. I did not hack her system. I simply exercised my legal administrative rights as her primary logistics vendor. With a single keystroke, I revoked the SSL security certificates for her primary domain. The effect was instantaneous. Anyone attempting to visit her luxury boutique website was immediately met with a massive red warning screen declaring the site unsafe and potentially fraudulent. I did not stop there. I accessed the API portal that connected her digital storefront to her global banking institutions. I severed the payment processing connection entirely. Customers who ignored the security warnings and tried to purchase her overpriced merchandise found their shopping carts frozen. Credit cards were rejected. Digital wallets failed to sync. The revenue stream that funded her entire glamorous existence flatlined in less than 40 seconds. Finally, I targeted her physical supply chain. I paused all automated routing protocols between her digital storefront and the global shipping warehouses. Thousands of pending orders were trapped in digital purgatory. Shipping labels ceased printing. Tracking numbers vanished from the system. I pulled up her live traffic analytics on my third monitor. I watched with clinical satisfaction as the bright green lines representing her active sales plummeted straight down to absolute zero. The cyber siege was complete and flawless. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and waited. It took exactly 14 minutes for the panic to set in. My secure desktop phone began to flash with an incoming priority call from Dominique registered business line. Normally, a distressed client calling the Apex Omni Logistics support number would be routed through a complex automated voice tree before reaching a Tier 1 technical support agent in a remote call center. Today, I had personally overridden the routing protocols. I programmed the system to recognize Dominique's specific cell phone number and forward her call directly to the encrypted landline sitting on my desk. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. I did not say a word. Dominique was hyperventilating on the other end of the line. She screamed into the phone demanding to speak to a senior systems engineer immediately. She shrieked that her entire website had gone dark, that her payment portals were rejecting thousands of dollars in international transactions, and that her warehouse dispatch system was completely paralyzed. She threatened to sue the company for breach of contract and demanded that the CEO be put on the line right this very second to answer for the catastrophic outage. I waited until she paused to take a ragged, furious breath. I spoke softly, ensuring my voice was crystal clear. I told her she was already speaking to the chief executive officer of Apex Omni Logistics. I asked her how I could assist her with her current technical difficulties. Dead silence fell over the line. I could hear the rapid, shallow intake of her breath as the reality of my voice registered in her brain. I could picture the exact moment the blood drained from her perfectly contoured face. She stammered my name, her voice dropping to a terrified, disbelieving whisper. She asked how this was possible. I informed her that her entire luxury brand operated on servers that I owned. I told her that her wealth was entirely dependent on digital infrastructure that I personally designed. I reminded her of the threat she screamed in the school lobby about ruining my business and leaving me begging in the streets. I suggested she check her real-time bank balances to see who was actually facing immediate financial ruin. Before she could formulate a response, I disconnected the call. I barely had time to log the interaction before the heavy oak door of my home office violently swung open. The heavy brass handle slammed against the drywall, leaving a deep dent. Andre stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He had clearly violated the terms of the restraining order Mia had secured yesterday. He looked absolutely unhinged. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and his tie was hanging loosely around his neck. He marched into my sanctuary waving a thick stack of hastily stapled legal documents in the air. He slammed the papers down onto my pristine glass desk. He leaned over, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. He screamed that I was completely out of control. He yelled that he had just spoken to a hysterical Dominique and that my petty vindictive hacking was going to land me in federal prison right next to him. He slammed his hand on the desk again, demanding I reverse whatever computer virus I had unleashed. He roared the exact words I knew he would. He screamed that I could not legally shut down her company. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached out and rotated my primary ultra-high-definition monitor until it directly faced him. The screen was filled with a massive complex spreadsheet cross-referencing Dominique incoming sales receipts with the offshore shell corporations Andre had been operating. I highlighted a specific recurring data column in bright, aggressive yellow. I looked at my soon-to-be ex-husband. I kept my expression entirely blank. I told him I did not shut her company down. I explained that I just stopped processing the fake invoices he was using to launder the church building fund. Andre stared at the glowing screen on my desk, as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. The aggressive yellow highlights on the digital spreadsheet were undeniable proof of his federal crimes. He staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. The arrogant bluster that had carried him into my home office vanished entirely. He turned and fled, stumbling over the threshold and leaving the front door wide open in his panicked escape. I calmly saved the server logs, secured the firewall, and sent an encrypted backup directly to Mia. Less than 2 hours later, my secure line rang. It was not Dominique screaming for tech support or Andre begging for mercy. It was Brother Thomas, the executive assistant to Pastor Jerome. His tone was icy and formal, stripping away the false warmth he normally used with the congregation. He instructed me to arrive at the administrative wing of the sanctuary immediately. He stated that the head of the family required an audience. He did not ask if I was available. He commanded my presence. I drove to the sprawling campus of the Atlanta Sanctuary of Grace. The building was a colossal monument to tax-exempt wealth. The parking lot was larger than most shopping malls, and the manicured landscaping looked like a luxury country club. I bypassed the main worship center with its thousands of plush seats and navigated toward the heavily guarded executive suites. The hallways were lined with thick imported carpeting and framed photographs of my father shaking hands with local politicians and national celebrities. I was escorted into the primary pastoral suite by a silent security guard. The room was specifically designed to intimidate and overwhelm anyone who entered. A massive stained glass window dominated the entire back wall, casting heavy, colorful shadows across the polished mahogany floor. Pastor Jerome sat behind a custom desk that was positioned on a slightly raised platform, ensuring he always physically looked down on whoever stood before him. He did not look like a loving father mourning the collapse of his family. He looked like a cornered monarch, calculating his next ruthless move. He started the conversation using his velvet pulpit voice. He folded his hands together and bowed his head slightly, playing the role of the weary, benevolent shepherd. He told me that my rash actions were tearing the sacred fabric of our family apart. He began twisting scripture with practiced ease, quoting verses about honoring thy father and mother, and lecturing me on the spiritual virtues of a submissive wife. He attempted to gaslight me with absolute precision. He claimed that the invoices I flagged on the server were not money laundering, but complex divine allocations meant to further the reach of the ministry. He told me that my lack of faith and my secular understanding of finance were blinding me to a holy vision. He stood up from his desk and paced the raised platform, pointing a heavy finger at me. He warned me that if I allowed my bitter jealousy to destroy the church finances, I would be personally responsible for ruining the entire community. He painted a tragic picture claiming the soup kitchens, the youth programs, and the community outreach centers would all collapse because of my selfish, vindictive pride. He tried to make me feel responsible for the very people he was stealing from. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, refusing to take the plush leather guest chair he had offered. I kept my posture rigid and my expression blank. I told him that federal agents do not care about holy visions when they are investigating wire fraud. My defiance was the trigger he had been waiting for. My father dropped the gentle shepherd act instantly. His face hardened into a mask of pure secular rage. He reached under his mahogany desk and pressed a concealed button. The heavy oak double doors behind me opened, and 3 senior church elders walked into the room. Elder Davis, Elder Vance, and Elder Montgomery were the financial architects of the megachurch. They were the men who moved the money, hid the assets, and protected the pristine brand of the Sanctuary of Grace. They wore tailored Italian suits and expressions of utter disdain. They marched forward and flanked my father, forming a solid, intimidating wall of patriarchal authority. Elder Davis took the lead. He did not bother with spiritual platitudes or Bible verses. He operated purely in the realm of threats and leverage. He delivered a cold, calculated ultimatum. He told me I had exactly 24 hours to restore the digital payment processing for Dominique Luxury Lifestyle brand and manually clear every single flagged invoice in the system. He demanded I contact the federal prosecutors immediately and officially retract all my statements regarding Andre, claiming I had made a terrible mistake due to emotional distress. Elder Vance stepped forward, his voice dripping with condescension. He informed me of the consequences of refusal. If I did not comply, they would launch a coordinated aggressive campaign from the pulpit and across all of the church highly trafficked media platforms. They would publicly brand me an unstable, hysterical thief. They would tell the congregation that I had embezzled from the church building fund to finance my own failing web design business, and that Andre was simply trying to cover up my crimes to protect me. Elder Montgomery finished the threat, promising to make me a complete pariah in the city. He swore they would leverage every political and business connection they possessed to ensure no one in Atlanta would ever hire me, sign a lease with me, or associate with me again. They threatened to destroy my reputation so thoroughly that I would be forced to flee the state just to survive. They stood there radiating arrogant confidence. They genuinely believed that the threat of public excommunication and total social destruction would break my spirit. They thought they had backed the quiet, nerdy sister into a corner she could not escape. They expected me to lower my head, apologize for my rebellion, and sign away my life to protect their empire. I looked at the 3 elders, taking in their smug expressions. Then I shifted my gaze directly to my father, sitting beneath the colorful glow of his expensive stained glass window. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen and maximized the media volume. I hit play on a highly encrypted audio file I had extracted from Andre's compromised local hard drive. The unmistakable voices of Andre and Dominique filled the cavernous pastoral suite. They were laughing together, a cruel, entitled sound. Dominique's voice echoed clearly from the phone speaker, stating how incredibly easy it was to manipulate the accounts because the elders never checked the digital ledgers. Then Andre's voice chimed in, delivering the fatal blow. He explicitly confirmed that Pastor Jerome had personally authorized the diversion of $50,000 from the congregation weekly tithes specifically to pay off the remaining balance on Dominique's custom sports car. I paused the recording right after Andre laughed about the congregation funding their luxury vehicles. The silence in the room was absolute and terrifying. The color drained completely from the faces of Elder Davis, Elder Vance, and Elder Montgomery. They turned their shocked, furious gazes toward my father. Pastor Jerome gripped the edges of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white as his own private crimes were laid bare before his financial enforcers. I looked at the elders and then directly at my father. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. I told him he was right. I agreed that the community would indeed be ruined when they found out their hard-earned tithes bought Dominique a Maserati. The 3 elders stood paralyzed as the audio clip ended. Pastor Jerome stared at me with pure venom, his pastoral mask entirely stripped away. The heavy gold cross resting on his chest seemed to mock the absolute silence in the room. Elder Davis opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The men who had just threatened to destroy my life were suddenly confronting the reality that their infallible leader was a common thief. I did not wait for their counterattack. I turned my back on the most powerful men in the Atlanta religious community and walked out of the executive suite. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, sealing them in a tomb of their own making. I knew I had struck a critical blow, but my father was a man who built his entire empire on controlling the narrative. He would not surrender gracefully. The retaliation came faster than I anticipated, and from an angle I should have predicted. My mother Vivian had always been the velvet glove covering my father's iron fist. The next morning, my phone flooded with texts from Mia telling me to turn on the local gospel radio station. It was the most popular morning broadcast in the city, reaching hundreds of thousands of devoted listeners during their morning commute. The host was a longtime friend of the First family, known for his booming voice and unquestioning loyalty to my parents. I tuned the dial just in time to hear my mother's voice, trembling with perfectly calibrated sorrow. She was weeping live on the air, her breath catching in all the right places. Vivian spun a masterful, tragic tale of a family broken by sudden mental illness. She did not mention the federal fraud charges, the empty warehouse, or the stolen trust fund. Instead, she told the entire city of Atlanta that her eldest daughter was suffering from a severe psychotic break. She claimed that my lifelong jealousy of Dominique's radiant success had finally driven me to sheer madness. She wept openly, begging the congregation to pray for my soul and asking for grace as the family dealt with my erratic, violent behavior. She painted Andre as a long-suffering husband, desperately trying to keep his family together, and Dominique as an innocent victim of my paranoid delusions. My mother weaponized her tears, turning her maternal concern into a public execution of my character. The sheer audacity of the broadcast was breathtaking. But the real damage was not to my reputation. It was to my son. By noon, my phone rang with the private number of Atlanta Preparatory Academy. It was Mrs. Sterling, the principal I had spoken with just days earlier. Her voice was strained and formal as she informed me that I needed to come pick up Trey immediately. There had been a serious physical altercation in the cafeteria, and my son was involved. I arrived at the pristine school campus, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found my 10-year-old son sitting in the sterile nurse office, clutching a blue plastic ice pack to his cheek. His eyes were red, angry, and utterly defeated. He refused to look at me, staring stubbornly at the linoleum floor. The school counselor gently explained that several older students whose parents were prominent, influential members of my father's congregation had cornered Trey during the lunch hour. They had mocked him brutally, repeating the vicious lies my mother had broadcasted on the radio that very morning. They told my son that his mother was crazy, that she belonged in an asylum, and that his father was divorcing her because she was a monster. Trey had thrown a punch to defend my honor and had taken a sharp elbow to the face in return. I knelt in front of my son, pulling his small, shaking body into my arms. I felt his tears soak into the shoulder of my silk blouse. In that quiet clinic, the last remaining thread of familial loyalty snapped completely. My parents were perfectly willing to destroy a 10-year-old boy, social and emotional peace, just to protect their stolen wealth and their unholy public image. They had deliberately weaponized my child. Playing defense was no longer a viable strategy. I could no longer just protect my assets and block their cyber attacks. I had to dismantle the entire foundation they stood upon. They wanted a war, and I was going to give them a scorched earth campaign. I brought Trey home, settled him into his room with his favorite video games, and walked directly into my digital command center. Mia was already there, spreading thick stacks of printed financial ledgers across my glass desk. She had not slept a wink. While I was dealing with the school crisis, my brilliant attorney best friend had been executing a deep dive, forensic audit of the Sanctuary of Grace corporate accounts. The audio recording of Andre and Dominique had given her the exact dates and account numbers she needed to pierce the thick corporate veil my father had constructed. Mia looked up as I entered, pushing her dark-framed glasses up the bridge of her nose. Her expression was a terrifying mix of sheer exhaustion and absolute predatory triumph. She told me that Pastor Jerome's arrogant hubris had finally eclipsed his basic intelligence. She explained that the $50,000 transfer for Dominique Maserati was just a tiny fraction of a massive, rotting financial iceberg. For the past 4 years, my father had been quietly bleeding the church building fund dry. He used the tax-exempt donations to finance his lavish pastoral lifestyle, to cover Andre's terrible high-risk investment choices, and to fund Dominique's phantom lifestyle brand. Mia slapped a heavily redacted banking document onto the glass surface, highlighting a series of complex wire transfers. She explained that 6 months ago, the church internal auditors had started asking highly uncomfortable questions about a missing $2 million. Desperate to balance the ledgers before the annual congregational business meeting, Pastor Jerome had committed the ultimate financial sin. He bypassed the board of elders entirely, forging their digital signatures on a series of binding corporate resolutions. He used those forged documents to secure a massive high-interest commercial bridge loan to replace the missing funds before the auditors could issue a formal subpoena. I stared at the paperwork, tracing the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts Mia had uncovered. I asked her what kind of collateral a legitimate bank would possibly accept for a $2 million commercial loan without proper verifiable board authorization. Mia shook her head, stating that he did not go to a traditional regulated bank. He went to a private equity lending group that specialized in distressed commercial assets and predatory lending practices. He took out the loan against the only asset massive enough to cover his tracks and satisfy the lenders. Pastor Jerome had put the actual deed to the Sanctuary of Grace megachurch up as collateral. The absolute magnitude of his betrayal hung heavily in the air of my office. He had risked the spiritual home of 10,000 devoted followers just to hide his own secular theft. If he defaulted on the shadow loan, or if the fraud was exposed, the private equity firm could legally seize the church property, evict the entire congregation, and sell the massive campus to the highest bidder. My father had literally mortgaged the house of God to pay for his children luxury cars and fake businesses. Mia traced her manicured finger down the final page of the loan agreement, following the convoluted trail of corporate ownership. The private equity firm was shielded behind layers of anonymous limited liability companies, making it nearly impossible for a standard auditor to trace the actual debt holders. She tapped the final holding company listed on the master deed transfer. Mia looked up at me, her eyes wide, taking a sharp breath. She gasped loudly, the realization hitting her all at once. She asked me if I realized exactly who owned the shadow corporation that bought the church debt. I did not blink. I slowly turned my leather chair toward my primary workstation. I typed a complex sequence of alphanumeric passwords into my encrypted terminal, bypassing 3 separate firewall authentications. I smirked, looking directly at my brilliant best friend as I unlocked my master digital vault. I told her that I did. I explained that I knew exactly who owned the debt because I bought it 3 months ago. Mia stared at me, her jaw actually dropping. She looked from the heavily redacted banking documents on my glass desk back to my face. The reality of what I had just said washed over her in slow motion. I did not just have leverage over my father. I owned his entire kingdom. I explained that 3 months ago, when the first discrepancies in Trade Trust Fund appeared, I had started liquidating a portion of my overseas tech assets. I knew Pastor Jerome would eventually need a massive influx of untraceable cash to cover his escalating financial crimes. He was a man addicted to the appearance of wealth, and that addiction made him entirely predictable. I had my wealth management team in Geneva establish a sterile anonymous holding company. When my father desperately reached out to the private equity sector for a predatory bridge loan, my holding company was the one that answered the call. I held the deed to the Sanctuary of Grace megachurch in my secure digital vault. My father was currently my tenant, and he was blissfully unaware that his eviction notice was already written. The timing of this revelation perfectly aligned with the most ostentatious event on the megachurch calendar. It was the week of the annual First Family Charity Gala. This was not a modest gathering of the faithful. It was a grotesque display of wealth masked as philanthropy. The city elite politicians, local celebrities, and the wealthiest donors would gather in a rented grand ballroom downtown. The tickets cost $5,000 a plate. My parents had spent the last 48 hours aggressively promoting the event on every local network, leveraging the momentum of my mother's tearful radio broadcast. They were playing the tragic, resilient family weathering the storm of my supposed mental illness. They wanted the city of Atlanta to see them as righteous victims standing strong in the face of adversity, but their real agenda for the evening was far more sinister. They were planning to use the gala stage to announce Dominique's massive global expansion. They needed a spectacular public distraction to legitimize the sudden influx of cash they were about to move. They were going to use the money stolen from Trey Trust Fund to finance this fake international launch, effectively washing the stolen funds clean under the guise of charitable investments and overseas vendor payments. They planned to filter the money through the Gala silent auction software, making it look like legitimate donations before routing it to their offshore accounts. It was a brazen, arrogant plan. I knew their entire timeline. I knew their vulnerabilities. What I did not expect was for the first crack in their alliance to seek me out directly. Late Wednesday evening, I was walking to my car in the subterranean parking garage of my corporate office building. The concrete expanse was cold and echoing the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. I unlocked my vehicle, listening to the sharp chirp of the security system disengaging. A heavy footstep echoed off the concrete pillar to my left. I stopped, my hand resting on the door handle. Andre stepped out from the shadows. He looked completely unhinged. The polished, arrogant executive who had slammed his fist on my parents' mahogany dining table just days ago was gone. His expensive tailored suit was crumpled and dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. The panic of the federal wire fraud charges was finally eroding his sanity. He was in direct, blatant violation of the federal restraining order Mia had secured, but I did not reach for my phone to call campus security. I wanted to see exactly how low he was willing to stoop to save himself. He approached me with his hands raised, palms facing outward in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He begged me to just listen to him for 5 minutes. His voice echoed in the damp air of the garage, shaking with a sickly, sweet desperation. He launched into a rapid-fire monologue designed to cast himself as the ultimate victim. He claimed that he never wanted any of this. He swore that the entire scheme was orchestrated by my father and my sister. Then he did exactly what narcissists do when the ship begins to sink. He threw his co-conspirator completely under the bus. Andre stepped closer, his breath visible in the chilly air. He told me that Dominique had manipulated him from the very beginning. He claimed she had seduced him, exploiting his momentary weakness and using her feminine wiles to cloud his professional judgment. He painted a picture of a predatory woman who had trapped him in a web of financial lies, threatening to ruin his career if he did not help her secure the bridge capital from Trey Trust Fund. He looked into my eyes, forcing a tear to pool in the corner of his own. He told me that I was his true love, his rock, the only woman who had ever truly understood him. He begged me to drop the federal charges, claiming we could take our son and start over somewhere new, away from the toxic poison of the first family. I stood perfectly still, watching the man I had married debase himself in the dimly lit garage. The urge to laugh in his face was powerful, but I swallowed it down. I did not scream. I did not hurl insults. Instead, I casually crossed my arms over my chest. As I brought my arms together, I discreetly tapped the face of my smartwatch twice against my wristbone. A tiny, almost imperceptible red light illuminated on the edge of the digital dial. The high-definition audio recording application activated, instantly capturing every single treacherous syllable falling from his mouth. I needed him to feel secure. I needed him to believe his manipulation was working, so he would return to the pack and lower their collective defenses. I forced my shoulders to slump slightly, adopting the posture of a woman worn down by heartbreak and exhaustion. I looked away from him, staring at the concrete floor. I let my voice soften, dropping the icy authority I had used at the school lobby. I told him that I was so incredibly tired of fighting. I manufactured a slight tremble in my voice, saying that the thought of breaking our family apart permanently was tearing me to pieces. Andre's eyes lit up with predatory triumph. He stepped forward, reaching out to touch my arm, but I flinched backward, maintaining just enough distance to keep the performance believable. I looked up at him with wide, vulnerable eyes. I told him that I needed time to process his confession. I said I could not make a major legal decision in a dark parking garage, but that I was willing to hear him out properly. I told him I would attend the annual First Family Charity Gala this weekend. I claimed I wanted to make peace with my parents and figure out a way to resolve this nightmare quietly without tearing the community apart. The transformation in Andre was instantaneous and revolting. The desperate, pleading husband vanished entirely, replaced by the arrogant, self-satisfied manipulator I knew so well. He straightened his wrinkled suit jacket and ran a hand over his hair, smoothing back the messy strands. A smug, victorious smirk spread across his face. He genuinely believed he had just effortlessly manipulated the weak, quiet sister back into submission. He told me he knew I would eventually come to my senses. He said the family would welcome me back with open arms as long as I recognized my proper place in the hierarchy. He turned and walked away, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the concrete, radiating absolute confidence. He truly believed he had just saved himself. I watched him disappear into the echoey stairwell. I uncrossed my arms and tapped my smartwatch, ending and encrypting the audio file. It immediately uploaded to my secure offshore cloud server. I opened my car door and slid into the driver's seat. The heavy door closed, sealing me inside the soundproof cabin. I connected my phone to the dashboard console. I did not call Mia. I bypassed my legal counsel entirely. I initiated a direct encrypted call to the federal field office. Agent Carter answered on the second ring. I did not bother with pleasantries. I looked at the dark exit ramp of the parking garage, my reflection catching in the rearview mirror. My eyes were cold-focused and entirely devoid of mercy. I told Agent Carter that the targets were accelerating their timeline. I informed him that Pastor Jerome and Andre were going to move the laundered money offshore live during the charity gala silent auction this weekend under the guise of an international business expansion. I gripped the steering wheel, wrapping my fingers tightly around the leather. I told him to get his tactical team ready because the first family of Atlanta was about to burn to the ground. Saturday evening arrived with the stifling, oppressive humidity typical of an Atlanta summer. But inside the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton, the air was crisp, heavily air-conditioned, and smelling of expensive perfume. The annual First Family Charity Gala was a masterclass in aggressive, unapologetic opulence. My father never did anything by half measures, especially when he was spending other people's money. The vaulted ceilings were draped in cascading white orchids and imported hydrangeas, creating a canopy of floral extravagance. Massive crystal chandeliers cast brilliant fractured light over 50 round tables covered in gold-spun silk. The city absolute elite were all in attendance. Politicians, local news anchors, professional athletes, and the wealthiest tithers of the Sanctuary of Grace congregation moved through the room with practiced elegance. They were there to pay tribute to the religious royalty of the city. Pastor Jerome and First Lady Vivian were holding court near the grand entrance, basking in the adoration. My father wore a bespoke velvet tuxedo that caught the light with every step he took, while my mother was poured into a shimmering emerald gown that screamed secular wealth. They played their roles perfectly, shaking hands, offering benevolent smiles, and accepting the hushed, sympathetic condolences from guests regarding their tragically unstable eldest daughter. They were actively soaking in the martyrdom, playing the brave shepherds, weathering a terrible personal storm. Every tear my mother wiped away was a calculated performance meant to solidify their victimhood. Across the room, Dominique was holding her own separate audience. She was draped in blinding borrowed diamonds that rested heavily against her collarbone, catching the chandelier light. She had Andre firmly attached to her arm, parading him around like a shiny new accessory she had just purchased at an exclusive boutique. Andre wore a smug, relaxed expression, entirely convinced that his parking garage performance had secured his safety. He laughed loudly at a joke the police chief made, throwing his head back in arrogant relief. They looked like royalty preparing for their coronation. They were preparing to announce Dominique's fraudulent global expansion, completely unaware that federal agents were currently sitting in unmarked sedans outside the service entrances, waiting for my signal. I did not enter through the main doors. I deliberately bypassed the red carpet and the flashing cameras of the local press corps. I walked through the secondary promenade, timing my arrival for the exact moment the string quartet shifted into a lively, upbeat tempo. For my entire life, my family had forced me into the role of the quiet, dowdy sister. They dressed me in muted colors, pushed me into the background, and conditioned the congregation to view me as the socially awkward tech nerd who lacked the divine charismatic spark of the first family. Tonight, I burned that carefully constructed image to ash. I wore a custom-tailored crimson gown that I had commissioned secretly weeks ago. The heavy silk moved like liquid fire, wrapping around my silhouette with devastating precision. My hair was swept up in an intricate, elegant style, exposing the sharp lines of my jaw and the cold, unyielding determination in my eyes. I wore no jewelry, save for a single pair of vintage diamond stud earrings my grandfather had left me. I did not need borrowed stones to radiate power. I walked into the ballroom with my spine perfectly straight, my shoulders back, and my gaze leveled directly at the center of the room. The reaction was instantaneous and intoxicating. The low hum of conversation nearest the promenade faltered. Heads turned. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. The congregation members who had spent the last week whispering about my supposed psychotic break stared in absolute shock. The woman walking across the marble floor did not look hysterical, bitter, or broken. I looked like a woman who owned the building. The murmurs rippled outward, carrying my name through the crowd like a shockwave. Dominique spotted me first. I saw the immediate flash of pure visceral panic cross her meticulously contoured face before she swiftly masked it with her trademark condescension. She dropped Andre's arm instantly and marched across the ballroom floor, intercepting me just as I reached the edge of the VIP section. She positioned herself, deliberately blocking my path while ensuring she had a captive audience. The mayor of Atlanta and his wife were standing just a few feet away, watching our interaction with poorly concealed curiosity. Dominique leaned in her expensive perfume, suffocatingly sweet. She dropped her voice to a harsh, carrying whisper meant to humiliate me in front of the city's most powerful officials. She asked me what on earth I thought I was doing crashing her night. She looked me up and down, her eyes flashing with venomous disdain, refusing to acknowledge how stunning I looked. She reached out and snatched a heavy silver tray from a passing catering waiter. The tray held 4 empty champagne flutes. Dominique shoved the tray directly toward my chest, forcing me to either take it or let it clatter loudly to the marble floor. She smiled, a bright camera-ready grin for the onlookers. She told me loudly that since I was clearly confused and having one of my little episodes, I might as well make myself useful. She called me the help, instructing me to take the dirty glasses back to the kitchen where I belonged. It was a classic Dominique power play, designed to trigger my anxiety and force me to shrink back into the shadows. She expected me to flush with humiliation, drop my gaze and flee the ballroom in tears, validating my mother's radio broadcast about my emotional instability. I did not shrink. I did not break eye contact. I reached out and took the silver tray from her manicured hands. I held it effortlessly, balancing it with perfect grace. I smiled back at her, a cold, sharp curve of my lips that did not reach my eyes. I turned to a hovering waiter standing frozen nearby. I gently placed the tray into his hands, thanking him quietly for his service. Then I stepped smoothly around my sister, leaving her standing flat-footed and speechless in front of the mayor. Her jaw tightened as she realized her public humiliation tactic had completely failed. I walked purposefully toward the exact center of the ballroom, where the primary VIP table was situated. This table was roped off with thick velvet cords, positioned directly in front of the main stage. It was decorated with towering floral arrangements, massive crystal centerpieces, and heavy gold flatware. It was the absolute focal point of the entire gala, meant to showcase the most elite donors. I unhooked the velvet cord, stepped into the private enclosure, and walked straight to the head of the table. I pulled back the heavy gold-gilded chair positioned at the very center, the seat explicitly reserved for the night's most honored guest. I smoothed the skirt of my crimson gown and sat down, crossing my legs elegantly. The audacity of the move sent a visible shockwave through the room. The polite whispers escalated into a frantic buzzing. Within seconds, the sea of guests parted, and my father marched toward the VIP table. Pastor Jerome's face was flushed a dark, dangerous purple. His heavy footsteps echoed his mounting rage. The velvet pastoral persona had completely vanished, replaced by secular, furious panic. He tore the velvet rope aside and loomed over me, leaning his massive frame against the table. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble meant only for my ears. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he tried to contain his explosive anger. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing. He ordered me to get out of that seat immediately. He hissed that I was ruining the most important financial night of the ministry and making a fool of the family in front of the entire city. He pointed a shaking manicured finger at the crystal nameplate resting just inches from my water glass. He told me that the seat was strictly reserved for the primary benefactor. He stated through gritted teeth that the seat belonged exclusively to the owner of the private equity firm that had just saved this entire church from absolute ruin. He commanded me to move before security dragged me out. I did not flinch. I did not break his furious, desperate gaze. I reached forward with a steady hand and picked up my crystal water goblet. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the absolute silence that had fallen over our immediate area. I lowered the glass, setting it down with a soft, decisive clink against the table. I looked up at the man who had lied, stolen, and manipulated his way to the top of a religious empire. I smiled. I know, Dad. That is why I am sitting in it. The blood drained from my father's face so fast he looked as though he might physically collapse onto the silk tablecloth. His mouth opened and closed, but the velvet pulpit voice he relied on for every crisis completely failed him. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He had not just borrowed money from a faceless secular corporation. He had handed the deed of his entire religious empire directly to the daughter he had spent years dismissing and destroying. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of absolute panic and rising secular rage. He opened his mouth to formulate a threat, but the sharp tap of a microphone echoing through the grand ballroom cut him off. The event coordinator, a frantic woman wearing a headset, hurried over to the VIP table. She nervously touched my father's arm, informing him that the local news affiliates were ready and it was time for the primary keynote address. My father closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, swallowing his panic and shoving his pastoral mask back onto his face. He shot me one final venomous glare, promising retribution before he turned and marched toward the grand stage. My mother Vivian shot me a look of pure disgust before linking her arm through his, playing the devoted, dutiful wife for the cameras. The ballroom fell into a hushed, reverent silence as Pastor Jerome took his place behind the lucite podium. The massive LED screens behind him illuminated, projecting his smiling, charismatic face to the 500 elite guests in the room. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning into the microphone and delivering a masterful performance. He spoke about the legacy of the First Family of Atlanta. He talked about weathering personal storms, a thinly veiled reference to my supposed mental breakdown, and how grace always prevailed. He was sweating heavily under the bright stage lights, but his delivery was flawless. He had the politicians, the wealthy donors, and the local celebrities hanging on his every word. Then he seamlessly transitioned to the real agenda of the evening. He adopted a tone of overwhelming paternal pride. He spoke about the future of the church and the importance of investing in the next generation of Christian entrepreneurs. He gestured grandly toward Dominique, who was sitting at a nearby table dripping in stolen diamonds and grinning for the flashing cameras. My father proudly announced that the Sanctuary of Grace was launching a bold new initiative to empower faithful business leaders. He declared that the church board had unanimously approved a massive seed grant to fund Dominique's new global lifestyle brand. He proudly proclaimed that her God-given business acumen would be supported by a $500,000 transfer from the Church Community Outreach Fund to launch her international expansion. The ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He was washing the money stolen from my son trust fund right in front of the mayor, the police chief, and the entire city elite. He was calling it a charitable grant. Dominique stood up from her chair, acting perfectly surprised and overwhelmed by the generous announcement. She pressed a hand to her chest, wiping away a fake tear as she began to walk toward the stage to accept her fraudulent crown. Andre stood beside her, clapping loudly, playing the role of the proud, supportive husband. They were bathing in the applause, entirely convinced that their criminal scheme had succeeded flawlessly. I placed my linen napkin on the table and stood up. I did not rush. I walked with slow, measured precision, moving directly toward the center aisle that led to the main stage. The custom crimson silk of my gown caught the chandelier light, making me impossible to ignore. A ripple of confusion washed over the tables nearest to me as guests recognized the woman they had been told was suffering from a violent psychotic break. I did not look unstable. I did not look hysterical. I looked like absolute execution. My father saw me approaching the stairs, and panic shattered his pastoral smile. He gestured frantically to the side of the stage. Two massive security guards wearing black suits and earpieces immediately stepped forward, moving to block the bottom of the stairs. They were instructed to physically remove me from the ballroom before I could reach the microphone. My mother gasped loudly, covering her mouth and playing the terrified victim for the front row. Dominique froze halfway up the opposite side of the stage, glaring at me with pure hatred. The security guards stepped directly into my path, crossing their arms to form a human barricade. My father let out a visible breath of relief, believing I was contained. I did not stop walking. I looked directly at the lead security guard, a man named Marcus. I offered him a polite professional nod. Marcus looked at me, and then looked up at my father on the stage. He reached up, tapping his earpiece before uncrossing his arms. He stepped entirely out of the way, grabbing his partner by the shoulder and pulling him back. They cleared the stairs for me, completely lowering their heads in a gesture of absolute respect. My father gripped the podium, his knuckles turning white. He had forgotten one crucial detail when he allowed his event planners to handle the logistics for the gala. He did not realize that the elite security firm hired to protect the ballroom tonight was a direct subsidiary of my corporate logistics empire. Those men did not work for the Sanctuary of Grace. They worked for me. I walked up the carpeted steps, my heels silent against the floor. I crossed the massive stage, moving with terrifying calm. My father stepped back from the podium, instinctively intimidated by the sheer cold authority radiating from my posture. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not acknowledge my mother, quiet, theatrical sobs. I simply reached out and took the microphone from his trembling hand. I turned to face the 500 guests in the ballroom. The silence in the room was absolute. The politicians, the elite donors, the journalists, they were all staring at me, holding their collective breath. They expected a meltdown. They expected the hysterical, jealous sister Vivian had described on the morning radio broadcast. I adjusted the microphone, tapping it once. My voice echoed through the cavernous room, steady, clear, and completely devoid of emotion. I welcomed everyone to the gala, thanking the mayor and the city council for their attendance. I stated that there had been a slight misrepresentation in the evening program regarding the financial structure of my family. I told the crowd that my mother had recently taken to the airwaves to share her deep concerns about my mental state and my failing web design business. I smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that caused a visible ripple of unease through the front rows. I formally introduced myself to the city of Atlanta. I did not introduce myself as Pastor Jerome's daughter or Dominique's sister. I announced myself as the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Omni Logistics, a multi-billion-dollar global supply chain management firm. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The wealthy donors who understood the massive scale of the corporate logistics industry stared at me in sudden, intense realization. They recognized the company name. They knew exactly how much power and wealth stood behind that title. My father staggered backward, nearly knocking over a floral arrangement. Dominique, face drained of all color, her heavy diamond necklace suddenly looking like a cheap prop. I did not give them a moment to recover. I turned my attention to my sister, who was shaking on the opposite side of the stage. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice ringing with lethal clarity. I told the crowd that I was incredibly interested in my sister's bold new international venture. I stated that I was fascinated by the $500,000 charitable grant my father had just so generously announced. I reached into the pocket of my crimson gown and pulled out a small black remote control. I pointed it toward the AV booth at the back of the ballroom. I told the silent, captive audience that my sister company was indeed expanding. I pressed the button. My sister company is indeed expanding, I announced to the silent room, expanding right into federal court. The massive LED screens behind me instantly shifted. The pristine logo of the Sanctuary of Grace vanished. In its place, a series of high-definition, heavily highlighted financial documents flashed across the massive displays. The screens lit up the dark ballroom with undeniable proof. The documents showed the exact routing numbers, the offshore accounts, and the forged digital signatures of the church elders. The screens displayed the precise wire transfers moving the church charity funds away from the community outreach programs and directly into Andre and Dominique personal banking accounts. The entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The silence shattered into a deafening roar of overlapping screams, shouts, and frantic whispers. 500 of Atlanta's most elite citizens scrambled backward, overturning gold-spun chairs and spilling vintage champagne across the polished marble floor. The local press corps, who had been invited to capture the first family triumph, immediately smelled blood in the water. Camera flashes erupted like a strobe light across the ballroom, illuminating the terrified faces of the church board members. The massive LED screens behind me pulsed with undeniable high-definition proof of grand larceny. The routing numbers, the offshore account details, and the forged signatures glowed in brilliant white light, casting a harsh glare over the panicked crowd. My mother Vivian reacted with pure visceral hysteria. Her carefully crafted maternal martyrdom vanished in an instant. She hiked up the skirt of her emerald gown and lunged toward the AV booth located at the back of the room. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, waving her arms and commanding the technicians to cut the feed immediately. She ordered them to pull the plugs, to smash the projectors, to plunge the ballroom into darkness. But the technicians simply stood there with their hands raised in surrender. They could not do a thing. I had anticipated this exact response. My elite cybersecurity team back at the Apex Omni Logistics headquarters had infiltrated the Ritz-Carlton network 3 hours ago. They had locked the soundboard and encrypted the visual feed with military-grade firewalls. The truth was locked on the screens, and Vivian could do nothing but watch her empire burn. While my mother screamed at the helpless technicians, Andre realized the grim reality of his situation. The arrogant smirk that had plastered his face all evening evaporated, leaving behind the pale, sweating mask of a coward. He did not look at Dominique. He did not attempt to defend the woman he had been parading around just moments prior. He dropped her hand as if it were coated in acid. He ducked his head, blending into the frantic moving crowd, and slipped away from the VIP table. He moved with desperate urgency, shoving past bewildered socialites and knocking a tray of hors d'oeuvres out of a waiter's hands. He was making a straight break for the grand mahogany exit doors at the rear of the ballroom. I watched him flee from the stage, tracking his pathetic retreat. I did not signal my security team to stop him. I did not need to. Andre reached the heavy brass handles of the double doors, throwing his entire body weight against them to escape into the night. The doors flew open, but Andre did not step into the empty corridor he expected. Special Agent Carter stood directly in the threshold, flanked by a dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked outside illuminated the hallway, painting Andre's terrified face in neon colors. Agent Carter did not smile. He simply stepped forward, blocking the exit completely. He asked Andre if he was leaving the party early. Before my treacherous husband could formulate a single lie, 2 agents moved in, grabbing his arms and slamming him against the mahogany doorframe. The sharp metallic click of federal handcuffs echoed sharply even over the roar of the ballroom. Back near the center of the room, Dominique was completely unraveling. The flawless golden child, the undisputed heir to the sanctuary of Grace Empire, was experiencing her first taste of absolute failure. She fell to her knees, her heavy borrowed diamonds dragging her down. The expensive silk of her gown pooled around her on the sticky champagne-soaked marble. She pointed a shaking finger at the LED screen, screaming that the documents were fake. She yelled that I was a jealous, vindictive liar who had fabricated the entire presentation using my tech company resources. She looked wildly around the room, searching for her partner in crime, searching for the man who was supposed to legitimize her fraudulent expansion. She screamed for Andre, demanding he come forward and tell the mayor the truth. But Andre was currently being read his Miranda rights while pressed against a wall by the FBI. Dominique was entirely alone, surrounded by a circle of horrified onlookers who were furiously recording her breakdown on their smartphones. She looked up at me, standing on the stage, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and desperate pleading. I looked down at my sister. I felt absolutely no pity. She had stolen from my son. She had manipulated my marriage. She had spent my entire life trying to grind me into the dirt. I raised the small black remote control in my hand. I stared directly into Dominique's eyes and tapped the button one more time. The financial documents on the massive screens dissolved, replaced by the pulsing green lines of an audio equalizer. The upbeat string quartet music that had been playing softly over the sound system was abruptly cut off. The low echo of the subterranean parking garage from Wednesday night boomed through the concert-grade speakers. Then Andre's voice filled the ballroom. His sickly sweet, desperate tone washed over the horrified crowd. Every guest in the room heard him confess. They heard him explicitly state that Dominique had manipulated him from the very beginning. They heard the man my sister had claimed as her devoted partner throw her completely under the bus to save his own skin. Andre's voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers, claiming Dominique had seduced him, exploited his momentary weakness, and used her feminine wiles to cloud his professional judgment. He painted her as a predatory mastermind who had trapped him in a web of financial lies and orchestrated the theft from Trey Trust Fund. The ultimate humiliation followed immediately. The audio continued capturing Andre begging me to drop the federal charges. The entire city elite listened in stunned silence as he called me his true love, his rock, and the only woman who had ever truly understood him. They heard him refer to my family to Dominique as a toxic poison. Dominique let out a guttural, agonizing scream. She covered her ears with her hands curling into a tight ball on the floor. The golden child had been publicly discarded by her partner in crime, stripped of her dignity and exposed as a common thief. The crowd backed away from her as if she were carrying a contagious disease. The mayor and his wife exchanged horrified glances before immediately signaling their security detail to escort them out of the building. The mass exodus of the city elite had begun. They could not distance themselves fast enough from the radioactive fallout of the first family. My father could no longer maintain his frozen state of shock. His empire was collapsing in real time. The legacy he had built on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and stolen wealth was burning to the ground right in front of his eyes. He snapped. He abandoned the velvet ropes of the VIP section and charged up the stage steps, moving with aggressive, heavy strides. Pastor Jerome ignored my security guards, who simply watched him approach. He stormed past me, his face twisted into an ugly snarl of pure rage. He grabbed a secondary microphone from the podium stand, gripping it so tightly the plastic cracked. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving, his perfectly tailored velvet tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He turned to face the remaining guests, the reporters and the federal agents moving into the room. He roared over the noise, his booming voice shaking the floral arrangements. He declared that the first family would not be intimidated by these demonic lies. He shouted that they were doing the Lord work and that the enemy was simply trying to tear down a righteous ministry. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at me. He yelled that this church is protected. He screamed that I could not touch them, that I was nothing but a bitter, vindictive child lashing out because I lacked the divine favor that rested upon him and Dominique. I stood perfectly still, letting him exhaust his lungs. I let him paint himself as the arrogant, untouchable king one final time. I turned my head slightly, motioning to Marcus, who was standing near the edge of the stage. Marcus walked forward, his face entirely expressionless. He handed me a sleek black leather binder embossed with the Apex Omni Logistics corporate seal. I took the binder and stepped directly into my father's personal space. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to project absolute power. I spoke directly into my microphone, my voice cutting through his hysterical ranting with terrifying lethal calm. I told him that I did not need to touch the church. I held out the sleek leather binder, offering it to him. He stopped shouting, his chest heaving as he stared at the black folder. He hesitated before snatching it from my hands. He flipped it open, his eyes darting across the heavily notarized legal documents inside. I watched the last remaining shred of his arrogance drain completely from his face, leaving him looking old, weak, and utterly defeated. I looked out over the ballroom, ensuring every reporter, every federal agent, and every remaining guest heard my final declaration. I told him that I own it. I explained that he had defaulted on the predatory bridge loan collateral debt 48 hours ago. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile that finalized his absolute destruction. You are officially trespassing on my property. The sheer volume of the panic was deafening. 500 of Atlanta's most influential citizens shoved against each other in a desperate, frantic bid to escape the blast radius of my family implosion. Crystal centerpieces shattered against the marble floor as tables were overturned in the stampede. Above the din, the sharp, authoritative commands of federal agents sliced through the panicked screams. Agent Carter's tactical team poured through every entrance, their dark windbreakers a stark contrast to the glittering gowns and velvet tuxedos. They moved with surgical precision. Two agents flanked my father before he could even register the reality of the black leather binder still clutched in his trembling hands. Pastor Jerome, the untouchable shepherd of Atlanta, gasped as his arms were wrenched behind his back. The heavy metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the microphone still resting on the podium. He stammered incoherent prayers demanding to speak to his lawyers, threatening the agents with divine retribution. It was a pathetic, crumbling display of a false prophet stripped of his altar. Andre was already secured by the exit, his face pressed against the polished mahogany doors, weeping openly as an agent read him his rights. Then they moved on Dominique. My sister had scrambled backward, her heels slipping on the spilled champagne, trying to crawl away from the flashing screens that broadcasted her federal crimes. An agent hauled her to her feet by her elbows. She thrashed wildly, the heavy borrowed diamonds scratching her collarbone. She shrieked that she was a victim, that Andre had orchestrated everything, that she was the first daughter of the Sanctuary of Grace, and demanded immediate release. The agents were entirely unimpressed, securing her wrists tightly with heavy steel. Seeing her golden child, her husband, and her empire being dismantled in under 3 minutes finally broke my mother. First Lady Vivian let out a sound that belonged in a horror film. Her knees buckled and she collapsed hard onto the marble floor. Her meticulously pinned wig shifted violently askew, sliding halfway down her forehead. She slammed her fists against the ground, crying hysterically, the emerald silk of her gown soaking up the spilled alcohol. There was no grace, no poise, no divine dignity left. The elite society of Atlanta captured every single humiliating second. The guests who had not managed to flee were standing on the periphery, their smartphones raised high, recording the absolute destruction of the first family. The community that had worshipped them just an hour ago was now actively participating in their public execution. The footage would be viral before the police cruisers even reached the precinct. I stepped down from the stage, my crimson gown sweeping the floor as I walked toward the main exit. I moved with slow, deliberate authority, parting the sea of whispering, recording socialites. The tactical team was beginning the perp walk, guiding my father, my brother-in-law, and my sister toward the service elevators to avoid the local press swarm gathering out front. As I approached the corridor, Dominique dug the heels of her stilettos into the carpet, forcing the agents holding her to a brief halt. Her perfectly contoured face was streaked with black mascara, her eyes wild with a feral, cornered rage. When I stepped into her line of sight, she completely lost her mind. She lunged forward as far as the agents would allow, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. She spat directly at me. The saliva landed inches from my crimson heels. She screamed that I was a monster. She shrieked that I was a jealous, bitter failure who could not stand to see her shine, and that I had maliciously destroyed our entire family out of pure spite. She wailed that I was the devil ripping apart the holy legacy our parents had built. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I took 2 deliberate steps forward, closing the distance between us. Because she was forcefully bent forward by the agents securing her arms, I bent my knees, lowering myself smoothly until I was directly at her eye level. The frantic buzzing of the ballroom seemed to fade into a vacuum of silence around us. I looked into her panicked, tear-filled eyes, my own gaze cold and unyielding. I held her gaze until her manic screaming faltered into a fearful whimper. I didn't destroy anything. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute finality. I just turned on the lights. I stood back up, smoothing the front of my gown, and nodded to the agents. They yanked her upright and dragged her down the corridor. Her despairing wails echoed off the walls until the heavy elevator doors slid shut, cutting her off completely. The ballroom was rapidly emptying, the glittering guests fleeing to their town cars, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal. The community had officially turned their backs. However, a small, terrified cluster of individuals remained near the devastated VIP section. The Sanctuary of Grace Church Board. These were the men and women who had blindly rubber-stamped my father's financial decisions, who had enabled his lavish lifestyle, and who were now staring down the barrel of total institutional collapse. They huddled together, their faces pale, watching me with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. They knew I held the deed to the megachurch. They knew I had the power to liquidate the entire campus by sunrise, selling the sanctuary, the community centers, and the private school to commercial developers. As I turned away from the exit, the head of the board, Elder Thomas, stepped forward. His hands were shaking visibly. The arrogant, dismissive men who had always treated me as the slow, unremarkable middle child were now bowing before me. Thomas practically fell over his own feet to reach me. He pleaded with me, his voice cracking. He begged me not to liquidate the building. He babbled about the congregation, the elderly members who relied on the community center, the children in the after-school programs. He swore that the board had no idea about the extent of Pastor Jerome offshore embezzlement. He promised that they would cooperate fully with the federal investigation, pleading for mercy for the sake of the innocent parishioners. I let him grovel. I let the silence stretch, forcing the board members to sweat under the harsh glare of the LED screens that were still projecting my family financial crimes. When I finally spoke, I stripped away any illusion that they had any bargaining power. I told them that their negligence had allowed my father to treat holy ground like a personal piggy bank. I informed them that they were equally responsible for the toxic culture of worshiping wealth over character. However, I am not my father, I stated coldly. I am a businesswoman, and I protect investments that yield positive community returns. I told them I would agree to lease the sanctuary and the community buildings back to the congregation. A collective audible sigh of relief washed over the board members, but I raised my hand, silencing them instantly. I outlined my strict non-negotiable conditions. I demanded that Pastor Jerome and First Lady Vivian be permanently stripped of all titles, honors, and access to the church campus. Their names were to be chiseled off the foundation stones. Their portraits were to be removed from the lobby. Their private pastoral suites were to be gutted and converted into a public food pantry. The First Family of Atlanta was to be entirely erased from the history of the Sanctuary of Grace. Furthermore, I demanded complete transparent oversight of all church finances by an independent auditing firm selected by Apex Omni Logistics. If they deviated from my terms by a single syllable, I promised I would bulldoze the sanctuary and pave it into a commercial parking lot. Elder Thomas nodded frantically, tears of relief and fear in his eyes. He agreed to every condition without a second of hesitation. The legacy my parents had violently sacrificed me to protect was now completely legally obliterated by my hand. I dismissed the board, leaving them to manage the wreckage of the ballroom. I walked out through the main promenade, leaving the stifling, perfume-choked air of the Ritz-Carlton behind. The humid Atlanta night air hit my face, feeling remarkably clean. The front of the hotel was a circus of flashing police lights, news vans, and shouting reporters pressing against police barricades. I bypassed the main entrance entirely, taking a quiet side exit that led to the secured loading docks where my private driver was waiting. I stood in the shadows of the concrete alcove, watching the flashing blue and red lights reflect off the surrounding buildings. The adrenaline that had fueled my flawless execution was slowly receding, replaced by a profound, solid sense of peace. For the first time in 31 years, I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the shadow. I was the architect of my own absolute freedom. The sound of heavy measured footsteps approached from the left. Agent Carter emerged from the dim light of the alleyway, his tactical vest still strapped tight across his chest. He stopped a few feet away, his hands resting on his tactical belt. His stern professional demeanor softened just a fraction as he looked at me. He told me that the transport vehicles were secure and the targets were currently being booked at the federal building. The First Family was officially in federal custody, denied bail pending their initial arraignments due to the severe flight risk their offshore accounts presented. I nodded, acknowledging the successful operation. I thanked him for his precision. Agent Carter stepped closer, pulling a small encrypted tablet from his vest pocket. He tapped the screen, reviewing a fresh incoming message from the Cyber Crimes Division. He looked up, his eyes locking onto mine with a look of profound professional respect. He did not offer a generic platitude. He did not offer sympathy. He offered the only thing I truly cared about. Agent Carter walked up to me as the police cruisers drove away. We recovered Trey Trust Fund in full, plus interest. 3 months later, the stifling humidity of the Atlanta summer had finally broken, giving way to a crisp and clear autumn afternoon. I sat comfortably on the wraparound mahogany porch of my newly purchased estate, a sprawling 12-acre property tucked away behind heavy wrought iron gates in the exclusive hills of Buckhead. The air smelled of fallen leaves and expensive jasmine. I leaned back into the plush linen cushions of my patio chair, wrapping both hands around a warm ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. From this elevated vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the custom-built basketball court spanning the lower half of the driveway. Trey was out there, his laughter ringing out clear and completely unburdened. He was playing a fierce, energetic game of 3-on-3 with a group of new friends from his private academy. Watching him sink a three-pointer and chest bump his teammate, a profound wave of absolute peace washed over me. He looked taller somehow, his posture straightened and relaxed. The heavy, suffocating shadow of my family toxic expectations that used to weigh down his young shoulders had completely vanished. He was safe. He was financially secure. He was finally allowed to simply be a teenager without being used as a financial pawn in a twisted game of generational control. The sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway pulled my attention away from the court. Mia's sleek silver Porsche Panamera rolled up to the front steps, gleaming in the autumn sun. She stepped out of the car, looking impeccable as always, in a sharp, tailored suit, holding a thick manila envelope and 2 fresh boxes of pastries from our favorite local bakery. She marched up the porch steps, sliding into the wicker chair next to mine, and dropping the heavy envelope onto the glass patio table with a satisfying heavy thud. "We have official signatures," she announced, a triumphant, predatory smile spreading across her face. "The judge expedited the final decree this morning right before his lunch recess. You are entirely legally and financially divorced from that parasite." I looked down at the thick envelope, feeling a massive invisible chain snap and fall away from my ankles. I thanked her, my voice thick with genuine gratitude. Mia had been the brilliant architect of my legal defense, the one person who had never doubted my sanity or my strength when my own blood was trying to have me committed. She opened a pastry box, taking a delicate bite of a butter croissant before delivering the rest of the updates. The federal prosecutor called her office on the drive over to share the latest developments. Andre had officially taken the plea deal, offering absolutely zero resistance once the FBI threatened him with a maximum sentence. He was going away for 10 solid years in a federal penitentiary in Allenwood. He had desperately tried to leverage his cooperation for a lighter sentence by offering to testify against my sister, but the feds already had all the evidence they needed from my own presentation. They did not need his help. They just needed him locked in a cage where he could never steal from another child again. As for Dominique and my parents, their reality was much grimmer. They were currently facing a brutal multi-state federal trial for racketeering, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Without the church charity funds to siphon, they were completely and utterly bankrupt. The state had immediately frozen all their personal accounts, seized their luxury vehicles, and foreclosed on the massive pastoral mansion they had proudly flaunted on magazine covers. The elite society of Atlanta, the same politicians, police chiefs, and wealthy donors they had worshipped and courted for decades, had universally exiled them. They were absolute pariahs, stripped of their divine titles, and left to rot in the very secular legal system my father had always claimed to be above. They were currently living in a cramped rented apartment, relying on an overworked public defender because they could no longer afford private counsel. I leaned back, looking out over the manicured lawn as Mia updates settled into the crisp autumn air. The journey over the past year felt like a grueling, punishing climb up a jagged mountain. For my entire life, I had been conditioned to shrink myself. I had been taught to hide my intelligence, to downplay my financial success, and to swallow my ambition just to make insecure people comfortable in their own mediocrity. I had played the dutiful, quiet scapegoat, absorbing their constant insults and their calculated theft because I falsely believed that blood required boundless sacrifice. I realized now how incredibly dangerous that lie truly was. Loyalty without respect is just self-destruction. I had survived their emotional abuse. I had survived their calculated financial sabotage, but I was no longer interested in mere survival. I had built a multi-billion-dollar global empire from absolute scratch. I had single-handedly dismantled a corrupt religious dynasty without raising my voice or shedding a single tear. I did not just survive the fire they set to burn me alive. I became the inferno. I was no longer the forgotten middle child or the crazy sister. I was the architect of my own destiny. I reigned over my life with absolute unyielding authority, and I would never apologize for wearing my crown again. The sharp professional chime of an incoming email from my laptop resting on the table broke my reverie. I flipped open the sleek silver screen. It was a priority message from my lead wealth manager at Apex Omni Logistics. The final deed transfers and zoning permits had been fully approved by the city council. The massive building that once housed the Sanctuary of Grace had been officially repurposed. It was no longer a monument to my father's greed and manipulation. It was now a state-of-the-art community tech hub for minority youth, fully funded and permanently endowed by my corporation. It would provide free coding classes, robotics labs, and entrepreneurship grants to the exact community my parents had exploited for decades. I read the confirmation twice, letting the sweet, poetic justice of it sink deep into my bones. I closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click. I picked up my coffee mug, taking a slow, savoring sip of the dark roast. The autumn sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant golden hour glow across the massive estate. I watched Trey score another point, his joyful, triumphant shout echoing through the old oak trees. I smiled as the warm sunlight washed over my face. The scapegoat was dead and buried. The queen had finally taken her throne.